forerunners of the idea of synchronicity. The causality principle asserts that the connection between cause and effect is a necessary one. The synchronicity principle asserts that the terms of a meaningful coincidence are connected by simultaneity and meaning. So if we assume that the ESP experiments and numerous other observations are established facts, we must conclude that besides the connection between cause and effect, there is another factor in nature which expresses itself in the arrangement of events and appears to us as meaning. Although meaning is an anthropomorphic interpretation, it nevertheless forms the indispensable criterion of synchronicity. What that factor which appears to us as meaning may be in itself, we have no possibility of knowing. As an hypothesis, however, it is not quite so impossible as may appear at first sight. We must remember that the rationalistic attitude of the West is not the only possible one and is not all-embracing, but is in many ways a prejudice and a bias that ought perhaps to be corrected. The very much older civilization of the Chinese has always thought differently from us in this respect, and we have to go back to Heraclitus if we want to find something similar in our civilization, at least where philosophy is concerned. Only in astrology, alchemy, and the mantic procedures do we find no differences of principle between our attitude and the Chinese. That is why alchemy developed along parallel lines in East and West, and why in both spheres it strove towards the same goal with more or less identical ideas. In Chinese philosophy, one of the oldest and most central ideas is that of Tao, which the Jesuits translated as God. But that is correct only for the Western way of thinking. Other translations, such as providence and the like, are mere makeshifts. Richard Wilhelm brilliantly interprets it as meaning. The concept of Tao pervades the whole philosophical thought of China. Causality occupies this paramount position with us, but it acquired its importance only in the course of the last 2 centuries, thanks to the leveling influence of the statistical method on the one hand, and the unparalleled success of the natural sciences on the other, which brought the metaphysical view of the world into disrepute. Lao Tzu gives the following description of Tao in his celebrated Tao Te Ching. There is something formless yet complete that existed before heaven and earth. How still, how empty, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven. I do not know its name, but I call it meaning. If I had to give it a name, I should call it the Great. Chapter 25. Tao covers the 10,000 things like a garment, but does not claim to be master over them. Chapter 34. Lao Tzu describes it as nothing, by which he means, says Wilhelm, only its contrast with the world of reality. Lao Tzu describes its nature as follows. We put 30 spokes together and call it a wheel, but it is on the space where there is nothing that the utility of the wheel depends. We turn clay to make a vessel, but it is on the space where there is nothing that the utility of the vessel depends. We pierce doors and windows to make a house, and it is on these spaces where there is nothing that the utility of the house depends. Therefore, just as we take advantage of what is, we should recognize the utility of what is not. Chapter 11. Nothing is evidently meaning or purpose, and it is only called nothing because it does not appear in the world of the senses, but is only its organizer. Lao Tzu says, because the eye gazes but can catch no glimpse of it, it is called elusive. Because the ear listens but cannot hear it, it is called the rarefied. Because the hand feels for it but cannot find it, it is called the infinitesimal. These are called the shapeless shapes, forms without form, vague semblances. Go towards them and you can see no front. Go after them and you see no rear. Chapter 14. Wilhelm describes it as a borderline conception lying at the extreme edge of the world of appearances. In it, the opposites cancel out in non-discrimination, but are still potentially present. These seeds, he continues, point to something that corresponds firstly to the visible, i.e. something in the nature of an image, secondly to the audible, i.e. something in the nature of words, thirdly to extension in space, i.e. something with a form. But these three things are not clearly distinguished and definable. They are a non-spatial and non-temporal unity, having no above and below or front and back. As the Tao Te Ching says, incommensurable, impalpable, yet latent in it are forms, impalpable, incommensurable, yet within it are entities, shadowy it is and dim. Chapter 21. Reality, thinks Wilhelm, is conceptually knowable because according to the Chinese view, there is in all things a latent rationality. This is the basic idea underlying meaningful coincidence. It is possible because both sides have the same meaning. Where meaning prevails, order results. Tao is eternal, but has no name. The uncarved block, though seemingly of small account, is greater than anything under heaven. If the kings and barons would but possess themselves of it, the 10,000 creatures would flock to do them homage. Heaven and earth would conspire to send sweet dew. Without law or compulsion, men would dwell in harmony. Chapter 32. Tao never does, yet through it all things are done. Chapter 37. Heaven's net is wide. Coarse are the meshes, yet nothing slips through. Chapter 73. Chuang Tzu, a contemporary of Plato's, says of the psychological premises on which Tao is based, the state in which ego and non-ego are no longer opposed is called the pivot of Tao. It sounds almost like a criticism of our scientific view of the world when he remarks that Tao is obscured when you fix your eye on little segments of existence only, or limitations are not originally grounded in the meaning of life. Originally, words had no fixed meanings. Differences only arose through looking at things subjectively. The sages of old, says Chuang Tzu, took as their starting point a state when the existence of things had not yet begun. That is indeed the extreme limit beyond which you cannot go. The next assumption was that though things existed, they had not yet begun to be separated. The next, that though things were separated in a sense, affirmation and negation had not yet begun. When affirmation and negation came into being, Tao faded. After Tao faded, then came one-sided attachments. Outward hearing should not penetrate further than the ear. The intellect should not seek to lead a separate existence. Thus the soul can become empty and absorb the whole world. It is Tao that fills this emptiness. If you have insight, says Chuang Tzu, you use your inner eye, your inner ear, to pierce to the heart of things and have no need of intellectual knowledge. This is obviously an allusion to the absolute knowledge of the unconscious and to the presence in the microcosm of macrocosmic events. This Taoistic view is typical of Chinese thinking. It is, whenever possible, a thinking in terms of the whole, a point also brought out by Marcel Granet, the eminent authority on Chinese psychology. This peculiarity can be seen in ordinary conversation with the Chinese. What seems to us a perfectly straightforward, precise question about some detail evokes from the Chinese thinker an unexpectedly elaborate answer, as though one had asked him for a blade of grass and got a whole meadow in return. With us, details are important for their own sakes. For the Oriental mind, they always complete a total picture. In this totality, as in primitive or in our own medieval pre-scientific psychology, still very much alive, are included things which seem to be connected with one another only by chance, by a coincidence whose meaningfulness appears altogether arbitrary. This is where the theory of correspondentia comes in, which was propounded by the natural philosophers of the Middle Ages, and particularly the classical idea of the sympathy of all things. Hippocrates says, "There is one common flow, one common breathing. All things are in sympathy." The whole organism and each one of its parts are working in conjunction for the same purpose. The great principle extends to the extremist part, and from the extremist part it returns to the great principle, to the one nature, being and not being. The universal principle is found even in the smallest particle, which therefore corresponds to the whole. In this connection, there is an interesting idea in Philo, 25 BC to AD 42. God, being minded to unite in intimate and loving fellowship the beginning and end of created things, made heaven the beginning and man the end, the one the most perfect of imperishable objects of sense, the other the noblest of things earthborn and perishable, being in very truth a miniature heaven. He bears about within himself, like holy images, endowments of nature that correspond to the constellations. For since the corruptible and the incorruptible are by nature contrary the one to the other, God assigned the fairest of each sort to the beginning and the end, heaven, as I have said, to the beginning, and man to the end. Here the great principle, or beginning heaven, is infused into man, the microcosm, who reflects the star-like natures, and thus, as the smallest part and end of the work of creation, contains the whole. According to Theophrastus, 371 to 288 BC, the suprasensuous and the sensuous are joined by a bond of community. This bond cannot be mathematics, so must presumably be God. Similarly, in Plotinus, the individual souls born of the one world soul are related to one another by sympathy or antipathy, regardless of distance. Similar views are to be found in Pico della Mirandola. Firstly, there is the unity in things whereby each thing is at one with itself, consists of itself, and coheres with itself. Secondly, there is the unity whereby one creature is united with the others, and all parts of the world constitute one world. The third and most important unity is that whereby the whole universe is one with its creator, as an army with its commander. By this threefold unity, Pico means a simple unity which, like the Trinity, has three aspects. A unity distinguished by a threefold character, yet in such a way as not to depart from the simplicity of unity. For him the world is one being, a visible God, in which everything is naturally arranged from the very beginning like the parts of a living organism. The world appears as the corpus mysticum of God, just as the church is the corpus mysticum of Christ, or as a well-disciplined army can be called a sword in the hand of the commander. The view that all things are arranged according to God's will is one that leaves little room for causality. Just as in a living body, the different parts work in harmony and are meaningfully adjusted to one another, so events in the world stand in a meaningful relationship which cannot be derived from any immanent causality. The reason for this is that in either case, the behavior of the parts depends on a central control which is supraordinate to them. In his treatise, De Hominis Dignitate Pico says, "The Father implanted in man at birth seeds of all kinds and the germs of original life." Just as God is the copula of the world, so within the created world is man. Let us make man in our image, who is not a fourth world or anything like a new nature, but is rather the fusion and synthesis of three worlds, the supracelestial, the celestial, and the sublunary. In body and spirit, man is the little God of the world, the microcosm. Like God, therefore, man is a center of events, and all things revolve about him. This thought, so utterly strange to the modern mind, dominated man's picture of the world until a few generations ago, when natural science proved man's subordination to nature and his extreme dependence on causes. The idea of a correlation between events and meaning, now assigned exclusively to man, was banished to such a remote and benighted region that the intellect lost track of it altogether. Schopenhauer remembered it somewhat belatedly after it had formed one of the chief items in Leibniz's scientific explanations. By virtue of his microcosmic nature, man is a son of the firmament, or macrocosm. I am a star traveling together with you, the initiate confesses in the Mithraic liturgy. In alchemy, the microcosmos has the same significance as the rotundum, a favorite symbol since the time of Zosimos of Panopolis, which was also known as the monad. The idea that the inner and outer man together form the whole, the oulomeli of Hippocrates, a microcosm or smallest part wherein the great principle is undividedly present, also characterizes the thought of Agrippa von Nettesheim. He says, "It is the unanimous consent of all Platonists that as in the archetypal world all things are in all, so also in this corporeal world all things are in all, albeit in different ways, according to the receptive nature of each." Thus, the elements are not only in these inferior bodies, but also in the heavens, in stars, in divels, in angels, and lastly in God, the Maker, an archetype of all things. The ancients had said, all things are full of gods. These gods were divine powers which are diffused in things. Zoroaster had called them divine allurements, and Synesius symbolic intisments. This latter interpretation comes very close indeed to the idea of archetypal projections in modern psychology, although from the time of Synesius until quite recently, there was no epistemological criticism, let alone the newest form of it, namely psychological criticism. Agrippa shares with the Platonists the view that there is in the lower beings a certain virtue through which they agree in large measure with the higher, and that as a result the animals are connected with the divine bodies, i.e. the stars, and exert an influence on them. Here he quotes Virgil, "I, for my part, do not believe that they, the rooks, are endowed with divine spirit or with a foreknowledge of things greater than the oracle." Agrippa is thus suggesting that there is an inborn knowledge or perception in living organisms, an idea which recurs in our own day in Hans Driesch. Whether we like it or not, we find ourselves in this embarrassing position as soon as we begin seriously to reflect on the teleological processes in biology or to investigate the compensatory function of the unconscious, not to speak of trying to explain the phenomenon of synchronicity. Final causes, twist them how we will, postulate a foreknowledge of some kind. It is certainly not a knowledge that could be connected with the ego, and hence not a conscious knowledge as we know it, but rather a self-subsistent unconscious knowledge, which I would prefer to call absolute knowledge. It is not cognition, but, as Leibniz so excellently calls it, a perceiving which consists, or to be more cautious, seems to consist, of images, of subjectless simulacra. These postulated images are presumably the same as my archetypes, which can be shown to be formal factors in spontaneous fantasy products. Expressed in modern language, the microcosm, which contains the images of all creation, would be the collective unconscious. By the spiritus mundi, the ligamentum animae et corporis, the quinta essential which he shares with the alchemists, Agrippa probably means what we would call the unconscious. The spirit that penetrates all things or shapes all things is the world's soul. The soul of the world, therefore, is a certain only thing, filling all things, bestowing all things, binding, and knitting together all things, that it might make one frame of the world. Those things in which this spirit is particularly powerful, therefore have a tendency to beget their like. In other words, to produce correspondences or meaningful coincidences. Agrippa gives a long list of these correspondences based on the numbers 1 to 12. A similar but more alchemical table of correspondences can be found in a treatise of Egidius de Vadis. Of these, I would only mention the Scala Unitatis, because it is especially interesting from the point of view of the history of symbols. Yod, the first letter of the Tetragrammaton, the divine name. Anima mundi, Sol, Lapis philosophorum, Cor, Lucifer. I must content myself with saying that this is an attempt to set up a hierarchy of archetypes, and that tendencies in this direction can be shown to exist in the unconscious. Agrippa was an older contemporary of Theophrastus Paracelsus, and is known to have had a considerable influence on him. So it is not surprising if the thinking of Paracelsus proves to be steeped in the idea of correspondence. He says, "If a man will be a philosopher without going astray, he must lay the foundations of his philosophy by making heaven and earth a microcosm, and not be wrong by a hair's breadth. Therefore, he who will lay the foundations of medicine must also guard against the slightest error, and must make from the microcosm the revolution of heaven and earth, so that the philosopher does not find anything in heaven and earth which he does not also find in man, and the physician does not find anything in man which heaven and earth do not have. And these two differ only in outward form, and yet the form on both sides is understood as pertaining to one thing." The Paragranum has some pointed psychological remarks to make about physicians. For this reason, we assume not 4, but 1 arcanum, which is, however, 4 square, like a tower facing the 4 winds. And as little as a tower may lack a corner, so little may the physician lack one of the parts. At the same time, he knows how the world is symbolized by an egg in its shell, and how a chick with all its substance lies hidden within it. Thus everything in the world and in man must lie hidden in the physician, and just as the hens, by their brooding, transform the world prefigured in the shell into a chick, so alchemy brings to maturity the philosophical arcana lying in the physician. Herein lies the error of those who do not understand the physician aright. What this means for alchemy, I have shown in some detail in my Psychology and Alchemy. Johannes Kepler thought in much the same way. He says in his Tertius Interveniens, 1610, "This, a geometrical principle underlying the physical world, is also, according to the doctrine of Aristotle, the strongest tie that links the lower world to the heavens and unifies it therewith, so that all its forms are governed from on high. For in this lower world, that is to say the globe of the earth, there is inherent a spiritual nature capable of geometria, which ex instinctu creatoris sine ratiocinatione comes to life and stimulates itself into a use of its forces through the geometrical and harmonious combination of the heavenly rays of light. Whether all plants and animals, as well as the globe of the earth, have this faculty in themselves, I cannot say, but it is not an unbelievable thing. For in all these things, e.g. in the fact that flowers have a definite color, form, and number of petals, there is at work the instinctus divinus, rationis particeps, and not at all man's own intelligence. That man, too, through his soul and its lower faculties, has a like affinity to the heavens as has the soil of the earth can be tested and proven in many ways. Concerning the astrological character, i.e., astrological synchronicity, Kepler says, "This character is received not into the body, which is much too inappropriate for this, but into the soul's own nature, which behaves like a point, for which reason it can also be transformed into the point of the confluxus radiorum. This nature of the soul not only partakes of their reason, on account of which we human beings are called reasonable above other living creatures, but also has another innate reason enabling it to apprehend instantaneously, without long learning, the geometrium in the radies as well as in the vocibus, that is to say, in musica. Thirdly, another marvelous thing is that the nature which receives this characterum also induces a certain correspondence in constellationibus coelestibus in its relatives. When a mother is great with child and the natural time of delivery is near, nature selects for the birth a day and hour which correspond, on account of the heavens, from an astrological point of view, to the nativity of the mother's brother or father, and this non-qualitative sed astronomis et quantitative. Fourthly, so well does each nature know not only its characterum coelestum, but also the celestial configurations and courses of every day, that whenever a planet moves de presenti into its characteris ascendentum or loca praecipua, especially into the natalitia, it responds to this and is affected and stimulated thereby in various ways. Kepler supposes that the secret of the marvelous correspondence is to be found in the earth, because the earth is animated by an anima telluris, for whose existence he adduces a number of proofs. Among these are the constant temperature below the surface of the earth, the peculiar power of the earth soul to produce metals, minerals, and fossils, namely the facultas formatrix, which is similar to that of the womb and can bring forth in the bowels of the earth shapes that are otherwise found only outside: ships, fishes, kings, popes, monks, soldiers, etc. Further, the practice of geometry, for it produces the 5 geometrical bodies and the 6-cornered figures in crystals. The anima telluris has all this from an original impulse, independent of the reflection and ratiocination of man. The seat of astrological synchronicity is not in the planets, but in the earth, not in matter, but in the anima telluris. Therefore, every kind of natural or living power in bodies has a certain divine similitude. Such was the intellectual background when Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, appeared with his idea of pre-established harmony, that is, an absolute synchronism of psychic and physical events. This theory finally petered out in the concept of psychophysical parallelism. Leibniz's pre-established harmony and the above-mentioned idea of Schopenhauer's that the unity of the primal cause produces a simultaneity and interrelationship of events not in themselves causally connected, are at bottom only a repetition of the old peripatetic view, with a modern deterministic coloring in the case of Schopenhauer and a partial replacement of causality by an antecedent order in the case of Leibniz. For him, God is the creator of order. He compares soul and body to 2 synchronized clocks and uses the same simile to express the relations of the monads or entelechis with one another. Although the monads cannot influence one another directly because, as he says, they have no windows, relative abolition of causality, they are so constituted that they are always in accord without having knowledge of one another. He conceives each monad to be a little world or active indivisible mirror. Not only is man a microcosm enclosing the whole in himself, but every entelechi or monad is in effect such a microcosm. Each simple substance has connections which express all the others. It is a perpetual living mirror of the universe. He calls the monads of living organisms souls. The soul follows its own laws, and the body its own likewise, and they accord by virtue of the harmony pre-established among all substances, since they are all representations of one and the same universe. This clearly expresses the idea that man is a microcosm. Souls in general, says Leibniz, are the living mirrors or images of the universe of created things. He distinguishes between minds on the one hand, which are images of the divinity, capable of knowing the system of the universe and of imitating something of it by architectonic patterns, each mind being, as it were, a little divinity in its own department, and bodies, on the other hand, which act according to the laws of efficient causes by motions, while the souls act according to the laws of final causes by appetitions, ends, and means. In the monad or soul, alterations take place whose cause is the appetition, the passing state which involves and represents a plurality within the unity or simple substance is nothing other than what is called perception, says Leibniz. Perception is the inner state of the monad representing external things, and it must be distinguished from conscious apperception, for perception is unconscious. Herein lay the great mistake of the Cartesians, that they took no account of perceptions which are not apperceived. The perceptive faculty of the monad corresponds to the knowledge, and its appetitive faculty to the will that is in God. It is clear from these quotations that besides the causal connection, Leibniz postulates a complete pre-established parallelism of events both inside and outside the monad. The synchronicity principle thus becomes the absolute rule in all cases where an inner event occurs simultaneously with an outside one. As against this, however, it must be borne in mind that the synchronistic phenomena, which can be verified empirically, far from constituting a rule, are so exceptional that most people doubt their existence. They certainly occur much more frequently in reality than one thinks or can prove. But we still do not know whether they occur so frequently and so regularly in any field of experience that we could speak of them as conforming to law. We only know that there must be an underlying principle which might possibly explain all such related phenomena. The primitive as well as the classical and medieval views of nature postulate the existence of some such principle alongside causality. Even in Leibniz, causality is neither the only view nor the predominant one. Then, in the course of the 18th century, it became the exclusive principle of natural science. With the rise of the physical sciences in the 19th century, the correspondence theory vanished completely from the surface, and the magical world of earlier ages seemed to have disappeared once and for all until, towards the end of the century, the founders of the Society for Psychical Research indirectly opened up the whole question again through their investigation of telepathic phenomena. The medieval attitude of mind I have described above underlies all the magical and mantic procedures which have played an important part in man's life since the remotest times. The medieval mind would regard Rhine's laboratory-arranged experiments as magical performances whose effect for this reason would not seem so very astonishing. It was interpreted as a transmission of energy, which is still commonly the case today, although, as I have said, it is not possible to form any empirically verifiable conception of the transmitting medium. I need hardly point out that for the primitive mind, synchronicity is a self-evident fact. Consequently, at this stage, there is no such thing as chance. No accident, no illness, no death is ever fortuitous or attributable to natural causes. Everything is somehow due to magical influence. The crocodile that catches a man while he is bathing has been sent by a magician. Illness is caused by some spirit or other. The snake that was seen by the grave of somebody's mother is obviously her soul, etc. On the primitive level, of course, synchronicity does not appear as an idea by itself, but as magical causality. This is an early form of our classical idea of causality, while the development of Chinese philosophy produced from the significance of the magical the concept of Tao, of meaningful coincidence, but no causality-based science. Synchronicity postulates a meaning which is a priori, in relation to human consciousness, and apparently exists outside man. Such an assumption is found above all in the philosophy of Plato, which takes for granted the existence of transcendental images or models of empirical things, the eidi, form species, whose reflections, eidola, we see in the phenomenal world. This assumption not only presented no difficulty to earlier centuries, but was on the contrary perfectly self-evident. The idea of an a priori meaning may also be found in the older mathematics, as in the mathematician Jacobi's paraphrase of Schiller's poem Archimedes and his pupil. He praises the calculation of the orbit of Uranus and closes with the lines, "What you behold in the cosmos is only the light of God's glory. In the Olympian host, number eternally reigns." The great mathematician Gauss is the putative author of the saying, "God arithmetizes." The idea of synchronicity and of a self-subsistent meaning, which forms the basis of classical Chinese thinking and of the naive views of the Middle Ages, seems to us an archaic assumption that ought at all costs to be avoided. Though the West has done everything possible to discard this antiquated hypothesis, it has not quite succeeded. Certain mantic procedures seem to have died out, but astrology, which in our own day has attained an eminence never known before, remains very much alive. Nor has the determinism of a scientific epoch been able to extinguish altogether the persuasive power of the synchronicity principle. For in the last resort, it is not so much a question of superstition as of a truth, which remained hidden for so long only because it had less to do with the physical side of events than with their psychic aspects. It was modern psychology and parapsychology which proved that causality does not explain a certain class of events, and that in this case we have to consider a formal factor, namely synchronicity, as a principle of explanation. For those who are interested in psychology, I should like to mention here that the peculiar idea of a self-subsistent meaning is suggested in dreams. Once when this idea was being discussed in my circle, somebody remarked, "The geometrical square does not occur in nature except in crystals." A lady who had been present had the following dream that night. In the garden there was a large sand pit in which layers of rubbish had been deposited. In one of these layers, she discovered thin, slaty plates of green serpentine. One of them had black squares on it, arranged concentrically. The black was not painted on, but was ingrained in the stone, like the markings in an agate. Similar marks were found on 2 or 3 other plates, which Mr. A slight acquaintance, then took away from her. Another dream motif of the same kind is the following. The dreamer was in a wild mountain region where he found contiguous layers of Triassic rock. He loosened the slabs and discovered to his boundless astonishment that they had human heads on them in low relief. This dream was repeated several times at long intervals. Another time, the dreamer was traveling through the Siberian tundra and found an animal he had long been looking for. It was a more than life-size cock, made of what looked like thin, colorless glass. But it was alive and had just sprung by chance from a microscopic unicellular organism which had the power to turn into all sorts of animals not otherwise found in the tundra, or even into objects of human use, of whatever size. The next moment, each of these chance forms vanished without trace. Here is another dream of the same type. The dreamer was walking in a wooded mountain region. At the top of a steep slope, he came to a ridge of rock honeycombed with holes, and there he found a little brown man of the same color as the iron oxide with which the rock was coated. The little man was busily engaged in hollowing out a cave, at the back of which a cluster of columns could be seen in the living rock. On the top of each column was a dark brown human head with large eyes, carved with great care out of some very hard stone, like lignite. The little man freed this formation from the amorphous conglomerate surrounding it. The dreamer could hardly believe his eyes at first, but then had to admit that the columns were continued far back into the living rock and must therefore have come into existence without the help of man. He reflected that the rock was at least 500,000 years old, and that the artifact could not possibly have been made by human hands. These dreams seem to point to the presence of a formal factor in nature. They describe not just a lusus naturae, but the meaningful coincidence of an absolutely natural product with a human idea apparently independent of it. This is what the dreams are obviously saying, and what they are trying to bring nearer to consciousness through repetition.